It was one of those nights when sleep seemed elusive, and the late hours began to blur into the eerie quiet of early morning. My room was dimly lit by the pale glow of my computer screen as I aimlessly browsed the internet, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had been creeping up on me. I found myself on Reddit, scrolling through various threads, until I stumbled upon a forum that I had never seen before, a place where users shared their most terrifying, inexplicable experiences. The thread was called Encounters with the Unknown, and the posts were chilling, each one more disturbing than the last. My curiosity was piqued, but something about the stories felt too real, too personal, like they had been written with trembling hands in the dead of night. One post in particular caught my eye. It was buried deep within the thread, almost as if it didn't want to be found. The title was simple yet ominous. They Come at Night. There were no upvotes, no comments, just an eerie silence that surrounded it. I hesitated for a moment before clicking on it, a strange sense of dread settling in the pit of my stomach. As the page loaded, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, as though I had just opened a door to something far darker than I could have anticipated. The post was a long, detailed account of someone's experiences growing up in a house that was anything but ordinary. The author, who remained anonymous, described nights filled with terror. White, ghostly figures that roamed the yard, their faces indistinguishable, but their presence undeniable. These apparitions were not just passing shadows. They seemed to have a purpose, a sinister intent that the author couldn't quite comprehend. Objects in the house would move on their own, as if guided by unseen hands, and appliances would flicker to life despite being unplugged, playing distorted, otherworldly sounds that echoed through the halls like a death knell. The more I read, the more I could feel the terror seeping into my own reality. The descriptions were vivid, almost too vivid, and I found myself glancing nervously around my room, half expecting to see one of those white figures lurking in the corner. The post ended abruptly with a final, chilling sentence. If you're reading this, it's already too late. My heart skipped a beat as I reread those words, trying to convince myself that it was just a story, a work of fiction crafted to scare gullible readers. But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I couldn't shake the feeling that the post was more than just a story. It was a warning that I had unwittingly ignored. I leaned back in my chair, trying to calm the racing thoughts in my head, but the silence in the room had taken on a new weight, pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. The air felt colder, the shadows darker, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly, utterly alone. Yet despite the fear gnawing at me, I couldn't let it go. I needed to know more. I needed to find out if any of it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I decided to investigate the story myself, to delve deeper into the darkness that the author had only hinted at. It was a decision born out of curiosity and a desire to prove that there was nothing to fear. But as I would soon discover, some doors, once opened, can never be closed, and some mysteries are far better left unsolved. As I prepared to dive deeper into the terrifying tale that had ensnared my thoughts, I realized that the details I was about to uncover might not only change my life, but also put me in unimaginable danger. The anonymity of the original post had already set an unsettling tone, but as I began my investigation, it became clear that there were reasons far more sinister behind the lack of identifying information. The author had mentioned people, places, and events so specific that I knew I had to tread carefully. Names and locations were either omitted or shrouded in vague descriptions, and now I understood why. This story was more than just a chilling account. It was a warning, shrouded in layers of secrecy. If I was to continue, I had to be cautious, not only for my own safety, but for the safety of anyone who might get too close to the truth. I decided to change the names of the people involved, to cloak their identities, in the hope that whatever dark forces were at play would remain unaware of my investigation. The author's caution echoed in my mind, and I knew I was tampering with something that could have very real, very dangerous consequences. The first name I changed was the protagonist of the original post. Let's call him James. James had been the one to grow up in that accursed house, the one who had lived through nights of terror as white figures floated silently past his window, their faces hidden behind an impenetrable veil of darkness. He was the one who had seen objects slide across the floor without cause, and who had heard the faint, eerie hum of a radio that should have been silent. Changing his name felt like a necessary precaution, a way to distance myself from the true horror of his experiences. But as I typed out the pseudonym, a strange sense of foreboding washed over me, as if the act of renaming him had somehow connected me to his fate. Next, I turned my attention to the house itself. I couldn't bear to imagine what had transpired within those walls, so I decided to refer to it simply as the house. The author had described it as an unassuming, nondescript building on the outside, yet within, it harbored secrets so dark that the very air inside was thick with malevolence. Windows that once let in sunlight were now nothing more than gateways to the void, and the shadows within seemed to move of their own accord, creeping along the walls like living entities. By stripping the house of its real name, I hoped to strip it of some of its power. But deep down, I knew this was a futile effort. The house had already taken hold of me, even from afar. But the most chilling change was yet to come. There was one figure in the story who loomed over everything, an entity that James had only referred to as the Shadow Man. This figure, according to the post, was no mere ghost. It was something far worse, a presence that defied explanation. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its form seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a blackness deeper than anything I had ever known. The Shadow Man was always there, lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. The few times James had seen it directly, he described an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very essence of fear had taken on a physical form. I couldn't leave this name unchanged, but as I attempted to come up with a new one, I found myself at a loss. Every alternative seemed inadequate, failing to capture the sheer terror that the original name invoked. In the end, I settled on The Watcher. It was a fitting name, one that conveyed the menacing vigilance of this entity, but even as I typed it, I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. The Watcher, like everything else in this story, was more than just a name. It was an omen, a harbinger of something far more terrifying than I could yet comprehend. As I made these changes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched myself. The air around me felt heavy, oppressive, and the shadows in my room seemed to deepen, as if responding to my actions. Each keystroke echoed louder than the last, the sound reverberating the silence of the night. It was as if I had crossed a line, a boundary that should never have been breached. By altering the identities in the story, I had somehow invited the darkness into my own life, and now there was no turning back. I sat back staring at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. The terror I felt was no longer confined to the story. It was here, with me, in my room. I had taken a step into the unknown, and I could feel the consequences closing in around me, like the tightening grip of an unseen hand. Whatever I had just done, it had awakened something, and now it was too late to stop it. After changing the names and trying to distance myself from the terrifying reality of the story, I couldn't resist the pull of the mystery. The original post had been vague about the location of the house, but there were subtle clues sprinkled throughout the text. A street name mentioned in passing, a reference to a nearby landmark, and a fleeting mention of an old, abandoned church on the outskirts of town. These breadcrumbs were enough to send me down a rabbit hole of online searches, digging deeper and deeper into the dark corners of the internet, where shadows seemed to have a life of their own. As I pieced together the fragments, I started to uncover more than I had bargained for. The house, it turned out, was infamous in local folklore, a place whispered about in hushed tones by those who lived nearby. The stories varied, but they all shared a common thread, a darkness that clung to the house like a shroud, a curse that had been passed down through generations. The more I learned, the more I realized that this wasn't just some ghost story. It was a place where something truly evil had taken root, something that defied logic and reason. But it wasn't just the house that unsettled me. As I delved deeper into the online forums and obscure websites, I began to notice strange things happening. It started with subtle changes. Web pages would take longer to load, and when they finally did, they displayed distorted images that made my skin crawl. Faces twisted into grotesque expressions, eyes that seemed to follow me across the screen, and strange, cryptic symbols that I couldn't decipher. The images were there for only a moment, but long enough to leave a lasting impression, searing themselves into my mind. Then came the messages. At first, they were nothing more than odd comments on the forums I frequented, but they quickly escalated into something far more sinister. Users with no history, no profile picture, and no traceable information began to send me private messages. They were short, unsettling, and written in a way that made it clear they knew what I was doing. "You shouldn't be digging into this," one message warned. Another read, "Some things are better left buried." Each message felt like a cold finger tracing down my spine, a reminder that I was treading on dangerous ground. Late one night, as I was combing through old archives, I received a message that froze me in my tracks. It was from a user who simply went by the name Watcher. The message was brief, just 2 words: "Stop now." But what truly terrified me was the attachment that came with it, a photo of the house. Only, this wasn't just any photo. It was taken from an angle that I recognized immediately. It was the view from my own window. I scrambled to the window, heart pounding, and peered out into the night. The street was empty, shrouded in darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there watching me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. How could anyone know where I lived? How could they have taken that photo? The questions swirled in my head, each one more terrifying than the last. I slammed the laptop shut, but it was too late. The damage was done. Whatever I had been searching for had found me first. From that moment on, the line between the virtual world and reality began to blur in ways I couldn't explain. My phone would buzz with notifications, but when I checked, there was nothing there. My computer screen would flicker, and for a brief second I would see that same twisted face staring back at me with hollow eyes. My email inbox filled with spam, but hidden among the junk were messages from Watcher, each one more menacing than the last. "You've been warned. It's too late now. We're coming. The worst part? was the sounds. At night, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I would hear faint whispers, as if someone was speaking directly into my ear. They were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakable, taunting, malevolent, and filled with malice. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the whispers still echoing in my mind, lingering long after the silence of the night had returned. As the days went by, I became more paranoid, more certain that I was being watched. The shadows in my room seemed to stretch longer, darker, and I began to see movement out of the corner of my eye. Quick, darting shapes that vanished the moment I turned my head. The house creaked and groaned, as if it were alive, responding to my fear, feeding off it. And always, there was that sense of being observed, of unseen eyes tracking my every move. Despite the terror that now consumed me, I couldn't stop. The mystery had taken hold of me, and I was trapped in its grip, unable to break free. I knew that I had gone too far, that I had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. But the pull of the unknown, the need to understand what was happening, was too strong. I had opened a door to something dark and ancient, and now it was coming for me. The digital world had become a gateway, a portal through which something malevolent had entered my life. And now, there was no escaping it. It was late, well past midnight, when I finally decided to shut down my computer. The relentless digging into the mystery had drained me. But as tired as I was, sleep eluded me. The air in my room felt heavy, thick with a tension I couldn't explain. My eyes darted to the corners of the room, as where shadows seemed to shift and pulse, as though alive. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me, telling myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of spending too many hours delving into the dark corners of the internet. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of the house, the watcher, and the strange messages I had been receiving. Silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling, no different from any other night. Yet this time, each sound seemed amplified, loaded with sinister intent. As the minutes dragged on, I found myself growing increasingly paranoid, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if the very air around me had taken on a life of its own, suffocating me with an invisible presence. And then it happened. A sudden chill swept through the room, so cold that I could see my breath in the dim light. My heart began to race, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as the temperature plummeted. I pulled the blanket tighter around me, but it did nothing to ward off the biting cold that now gripped the room. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows in the corners deepened, growing darker, more tangible. It was then that I heard it, the faintest of whispers, barely audible yet unmistakable. At first I thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, more distinct, until it was clear that it was a voice. The words were unintelligible, a garbled string of syllables that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to be all around me, surrounding me, echoing off the walls. My pulse quickened as I scanned the room, my eyes wide with fear. But there was no one there. I was alone, or at least I should have been. The whispering grew more insistent, more urgent, as if trying to communicate something important, something terrible. I strained to make out the words, but they slipped through my grasp like smoke. The voice was low, almost guttural, filled with a malice that made my blood run cold. It was then that I noticed the shadows in the room weren't just shadows. They were moving, shifting slowly, deliberately, as if they were alive. I could feel them watching me, their presence oppressive and overwhelming. The air was thick with dread, and I felt a primal fear take hold, the kind that grips you when you know you are in the presence of something far beyond your understanding. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that when I opened them, everything would be back to normal. But the moment I did, I saw it. A figure, standing at the foot of my bed. It was barely visible, a dark silhouette against the even darker room, but I could make out the vague outline of a tall, gaunt figure. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, paralyzed with fear. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was undeniable, suffocating. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them, and the weight of its gaze was enough to pin me to the bed. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed in on me from all sides. The figure remained still, its form blending seamlessly with the shadows, as if it were part of them. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, frozen in place, as the figure continued to watch me. The cold seeped into my bones, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing loudly in the oppressive quiet. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure began to dissolve, melting back into the darkness from which it had emerged. The temperature in the room slowly began to rise, the shadows receding back into the corners, and the suffocating presence lifted. I lay there, trembling, unable to process what had just happened. The figure was gone, but the fear it had left behind lingered thick and palpable. For a long time, I didn't move, too terrified to even breathe. The room was silent once more, the only sound the frantic beating of my heart. But I knew, deep down, that whatever had been in my room hadn't truly left. It was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting, watching. I had crossed a line, ventured too far into the darkness, and now there was no going back. The supernatural had become my reality, and the terror I had only read about was now very real, very close. The first encounter was just the beginning. I knew that much. The darkness had found me, and it wasn't going to let me go. After that first encounter, my life descended into a nightmare from which there seemed no escape. The following nights were plagued with an overwhelming sense of dread, a constant awareness that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. The figure that had appeared at the foot of my bed haunted my thoughts, its dark silhouette etched into my memory. But as terrifying as that encounter had been, it was only the beginning. What followed was a slow, creeping escalation of horror that pushed me to the brink of madness. At first, it was the feeling of being watched, a sensation so intense that it felt as though 1,000 invisible eyes were tracking my every move. No matter where I went or what I did, the sensation was there, an oppressive weight that bore down on me, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. I would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shadows that disappeared the moment I turned to face them. My reflection in the mirror seemed wrong, distorted somehow, as though something was lurking just behind me, waiting for the moment I would let my guard down. The whispers returned, no longer faint and indistinct, but clear and menacing, hissing my name in the dead of night. They echoed through my room, reverberating off the walls in a chorus of malevolent voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Each night, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like they were inside my head, drilling into my mind with their relentless, unintelligible chants. Sleep became a distant memory, as every time I closed my eyes, the whispers would surge, filling the darkness with their ominous presence. It wasn't long before the physical manifestations began. Objects in my home started to move on their own, subtle at first. Just a book sliding off the shelf, a chair shifting slightly out of place, but soon these movements became more aggressive, more deliberate. One night, as I sat at my desk, the lamp beside me flickered before suddenly crashing to the floor with a force that sent shards of glass scattering across the room. I jumped back, heart pounding, but I was too terrified to investigate. It was as if an invisible hand had swiped it off the table, angry at my defiance, punishing me for daring to continue my investigation. Then there were the footsteps. At first they were faint, barely audible above the ambient sounds of the house settling, but soon they grew louder, more distinct, the heavy, deliberate tread of someone or something pacing just outside my bedroom door. The floorboards creaked under the weight of those unseen steps, the sound growing closer with each passing night. I would lie in bed, paralyzed with fear, as the footsteps approached, stopping just outside the door, only to retreat moments later. But the terror didn't end there. On more than one occasion, I heard the handle of my door rattle as if someone was trying to get in. My nerves were frayed, my sanity hanging by a thread. The once familiar comfort of my home had become a prison, a place where every shadow, every sound, threatened to be the harbinger of some unspeakable horror. The terror was relentless, an ever-present force that gnawed at my mind, driving me to the brink of a breakdown. The whispers, the shadows, the footsteps, they all seemed to be leading up to something far worse than anything I had yet experienced. The nights were the worst. I could feel the presence growing stronger, more malevolent, as the hours of darkness stretched on. It was as if the very walls of my house were closing in on me, suffocating me with their oppressive weight. The air became thick with tension, crackling with a malevolent energy that set my nerves on edge. The shadows in the corners of my room deepened, taking on forms that I dared not try to identify. And always, there was that sense of being watched, as though the figure from that first night was still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The final straw came one night when I awoke to the sensation of something cold and heavy pressing down on my chest. My eyes flew open, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my body frozen in place by an unseen force. The room was plunged into darkness, but I could feel the presence hovering over me, its breath cold against my skin. Panic surged through me as I tried to scream, to move, to do anything, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped, helpless, as the pressure on my chest increased, forcing the air from my lungs. It felt as though I was being crushed by an invisible weight, my vision darkening at the edges as I struggled to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The pressure lifted, and I gasped for air, my chest heaving as I fought to regain control of my body. The room was silent once more, the oppressive presence gone, but the terror remained, etched into my very soul. I knew in that moment that whatever was tormenting me was far from finished. It was playing with me, testing the limits of my sanity, pushing me closer and closer to the edge. The escalation of horror had reached a new level, and I knew that the worst was yet to come. The entity, whatever it was, had made its presence known, and it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed me as its own. The darkness had taken hold, and there was no escaping it. My home, my sanctuary, had become a battleground, and I was fighting a losing war against a force I couldn't see, couldn't understand. The terror was unrelenting, and I knew that my only option was to keep going, to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. But as the nights grew longer and the presence grew stronger, I couldn't help but wonder, would I survive long enough to find it? The relentless terror that had been consuming my life was leading me to a breaking point. Sleep was a distant memory, and every waking moment was spent in fear of the next supernatural assault. But it wasn't just the fear that was wearing me down. It was the gnawing sense that there was something I had overlooked, something that could explain why this was happening to me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a darker truth lurking beneath the surface, a truth that I was too terrified to face. Desperation drove me to dig deeper into the history of the house. I combed through old newspaper archives, forgotten forums, and obscure websites, trying to piece together the fragments of a story that had been buried for decades. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that I stumbled upon a local legend, one that sent chills down my spine. The legend spoke of a curse, one that had been placed on the land long before the house was even built. The curse was said to have originated from a pact made with a dark entity, an entity that demanded a heavy price for its favors. As I delved further, the pieces began to fall into place. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a man named Jonathan Graves, a wealthy landowner who had acquired the land under mysterious circumstances. According to the legend, Graves had been a man of ambition, desperate for power and wealth. But when conventional means failed him, he turned to the occult. It was said that Graves had performed a ritual on the land, invoking an ancient spirit in exchange for prosperity. The ritual required a blood sacrifice, and the story went that Graves had sacrificed his own wife and child to seal the pact. But the dark spirit that Graves had summoned was not content with just one sacrifice. The entity, known only as the Watcher, demanded more. An endless cycle of death and suffering to sustain its power. And so, the curse was born, binding the Watcher to the land and dooming all who lived there to a fate worse than death. The house, built on cursed ground, became a conduit for the Watcher's malevolence, a place where the lines between the living and the dead blurred, and where darkness reigned. The more I learned, the more the pieces of my own torment began to make sense. The Watcher, the figure that had haunted me in the shadows, the source of the whispers and the moving objects, was the entity that Jonathan Graves had unleashed all those years ago. And by investigating the house, by uncovering its secrets, I had somehow drawn the Watcher's attention, inviting its wrath into my life. The messages, the footsteps, the chilling encounters, they were all signs that the Watcher had claimed me as its next victim. The horror of the revelation was overwhelming, but there was something even more disturbing that I discovered. Hidden deep within the archives was a record of previous owners of the house, each one suffering tragic, violent deaths. Some had died in inexplicable accidents, others had been driven to madness, but all had met a grisly end. And then, there was one final entry that made my blood run cold. It was an article from the early 1990s detailing the disappearance of a man who had been investigating the house, much like I was now. His name was James, a name I had chosen at random for the protagonist of my story, but now I realized that it wasn't random at all. The man had disappeared without a trace. His final words scrawled in blood on the wall of the house. "It's here. I was no longer just an observer. I was part of the story." The Watcher had been waiting for someone like me, someone who would uncover the truth and give it the attention it craved. The more I learned, the more I realized that I was falling into the same trap as James, the man who had come before me. The parallels were too strong to ignore, and I knew that if I continued down this path, I would meet the same fate. But It was too late to turn back. I had gone too far, and the Watcher was not going to let me go. The final piece of the puzzle came in the form of an old, dusty journal that I found referenced in one of the forums. The journal belonged to Jonathan Graves himself, and it detailed the ritual he had performed as well as his descent into madness as the entity he had summoned began to consume him. The journal was filled with ramblings about the Watcher, descriptions of a tall, shadowy figure that followed him everywhere, whispering in his ear, driving him to the brink of insanity. But the most chilling part was the last entry, written in a shaky hand, barely legible. "The price is my soul, and now it comes for me. Beware, for it seeks another." The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The curse had not just been about the house or the land, it was about the people who came into contact with it. Jonathan Graves had sealed his fate with the ritual, and in doing so, he had doomed all who followed him. The house was a trap, a lure for those who were drawn to the darkness, and once you were caught in its web, there was no escape. The Watcher didn't just haunt the house, it haunted the souls of those who uncovered its secret, feeding on their fear, their despair, until there was nothing left. I had become the latest in a long line of victims, drawn into the curse by my own curiosity, my own desire to uncover the truth. And now, there was no way out. The terror that had been building inside me was nothing compared to the dread that now filled my heart. The Watcher was coming for me, and I knew that when it finally did, there would be no mercy, no escape. The curse had claimed another soul, and this time, it was mine. The days leading up to the final confrontation were a blur of fear and anxiety. My every waking moment was consumed by the knowledge that the Watcher was closing in on me, its presence growing stronger with each passing hour. I could feel it lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, a shadow that clung to my every thought, every breath. The whispers that had once haunted only the nights now followed me throughout the day, seeping into my mind like poison, filling my head with dark, twisted thoughts that weren't my own. The line between reality and nightmare had become impossibly blurred, and I was teetering on the edge of madness. I tried to escape, to flee from the house, from the curse, but no matter where I went, the darkness followed. The Watcher was bound to me now, and there was no running from its grasp. I could feel it in the air, a cold, suffocating presence that clung to my skin like a shroud. The shadows in my home had taken on a life of their own, twisting and writhing in the corners of my vision, forming shapes that were almost, but not quite, human. They taunted me, mocking my fear, daring me to face what was coming. As the final night approached, the house seemed to come alive with malevolent energy. The walls groaned as if under some immense, unseen pressure, and the floors creaked with every step, as though the very foundation of the house was shifting. The lights flickered ominously, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the walls in eerie, unnatural patterns. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and I could taste the rot on my tongue, a bitter reminder of the fate that awaited me. I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. The Watcher was calling to me, beckoning me to face it, to confront the horror that had been building in the depths of my mind. I felt a strange, almost primal compulsion to go to the one place I had avoided, the basement. It was a place I'd instinctively feared since the first encounter, a place where the darkness seemed to gather, pooling like thick black ink. I had always sensed that something terrible lay in wait down there, something that I wasn't meant to see. But now, I had no choice. The pull was too strong, and I knew that if I didn't go willingly, the Watcher would drag me there itself. With trembling hands, I descended the creaking stairs into the basement, each step echoing in the oppressive silence. The air grew colder with every step, until my breath came out in visible puffs of mist. The shadows here were different, thicker, darker, and they seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if they were alive. I could feel eyes on me, unseen but undeniable, and my heart pounded in my chest, each beat a thunderous drum in the eerie quiet. At the bottom of the stairs, the darkness was absolute, swallowing the faint light from my phone like a hungry beast. The basement was empty, save for the remnants of the past, old decaying furniture, boxes filled with forgotten memories, and a thick layer of dust that coated everything like a blanket. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel the Watcher there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to take the final step, to fully surrender to the terror it had been feeding on. I stood frozen, unable to move, as the air around me grew heavy, almost solid, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. The shadows began to shift, swirling together in the center of the room, coalescing into a form that was at once familiar and utterly alien. The figure that emerged from the darkness was tall, impossibly so, its body a twisted, writhing mass of shadow and smoke. Its eyes were the only feature visible in the dark, two pinpricks of glowing red that burned with a hatred so intense it was almost tangible. The Watcher had revealed itself at last. It stood before me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I could feel it probing into my mind, peeling back the layers of my thoughts, my memories, exposing every fear, every doubt. The whispers that had haunted me for so long now rose to a deafening crescendo, a chorus of malevolent voices that filled the room with their dark, twisted melody. They spoke of despair, of pain, of the futility of resistance. They promised me an end to the suffering, a release from the terror, if only I would surrender, if only I would give in. But surrender wasn't an option. I had come this far, and I knew that there was no turning back. I gathered what little courage I had left and took a step forward, refusing to let the Watcher's presence break me. My voice trembled as I spoke, the words barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. "What, me?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fear and defiance. "What do you want?" The Watcher didn't speak, but I felt its answer deep within my mind, a cold, dark truth that settled into my bones. It wasn't about me. This was never about me. I was just the latest in a long line of victims, drawn to the house by the same curiosity, the same need for answers that had doomed so many before me. The Watcher didn't want anything from me other than my fear, my despair. It fed on those emotions, growing stronger with each new soul it claimed, and it had been doing so for centuries. But there was something more, something that the Watcher had been hiding. In the depths of my mind, buried beneath the layers of terror and despair, I saw a glimpse of the truth. A truth so dark, so horrifying, that it threatened to break me. The Watcher wasn't just some malevolent spirit, some ancient curse. It was the embodiment of the very fear that had consumed the lives of those who had lived and died in the house. It was a manifestation of the darkness that dwelled within us all, brought to life by the collective horror of generations, and now it was my turn to feed it. The revelation struck me like a physical blow, and I staggered back, my mind reeling from the weight of the truth. The Watcher moved closer, its form towering over me, its eyes burning with a terrible hunger. The shadows around it pulsed, reaching out to me, enveloping me in their cold embrace. I could feel my strength draining away, my resolve crumbling under the onslaught of terror that the Watcher unleashed. I was losing the battle, And I knew that if I didn't do something, if I didn't fight back, I would become just another name in the long list of victims claimed by the house. In a final, desperate act, I reached out, grasping for anything that could help me break free from the Watcher's grip. My hand brushed against something cold and metallic, an old, rusted piece of the furniture that had been left to decay in the basement. I wrapped my fingers around it, using the sharp edge to cut through the thick tendrils of shadow that had wrapped themselves around me. The pain was sharp, immediate, but it brought me back to reality, grounding me in the physical world. The Watcher recoiled, its form flickering, the shadows retreating slightly as I fought back. I could feel its anger, its frustration, as it tried to reassert its control, but I held on, refusing to let it drag me down into the darkness. With one final surge of strength, I forced the shadows back, breaking free from their grip and staggering to my feet. The Watcher's form began to dissolve, the shadows losing their cohesion, retreating back into the darkness from which they had emerged. But even as it faded, I knew this wasn't over. The Watcher was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity. But for now, I had won. I had survived. The basement was silent once more, the oppressive presence lifted, but the fear remained, a cold knot in the pit of my stomach. I knew that this victory was temporary, that the Watcher would return, stronger and more determined than ever, but for now, I was alive, and that was all that mattered. I climbed the stairs out of the basement, each step heavy with the knowledge of what I had just faced. The house was quiet, the shadows still, but I could feel the lingering presence of the Watcher, a dark stain on the very fabric of the place. I had uncovered the truth, but the cost had been high. The Watcher had claimed its price, and I knew that it would continue to haunt me, to feed on my fear, until it finally consumed me. But as I stepped out into the cold night air, I made a vow. I would not let the Watcher win. I would find a way to break the curse, to free myself from the darkness that had claimed so many before me. The battle was far from over, but I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. And no matter how strong the Watcher was, no matter how deep the darkness ran, I would fight it with everything I had. The night was dark, the air thick with the promise of more horrors to come, but I walked away from the house with my head held high. The Watcher was still there, lurking in the shadows, but so was I. And as long as I had the will to fight, the darkness would never claim me. But even as I left the house behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Watcher had been waiting for someone like me, and now that it had found me, it wouldn't let go easily. The darkness was still there, still hungry, and I knew that the final confrontation was yet to come. The confrontation with the Watcher had left me scarred, both physically and mentally. Though I had managed to drive it back, the sense of dread never truly left me. Every creak in the house, every flicker of the lights sent a jolt of fear through my body, reminding me that the Watcher was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next opportunity. I had escaped for now, but I knew that the battle was far from over. The darkness was patient, and it would return stronger, more determined, and I had no idea if I could survive another encounter. I tried to resume some semblance of a normal life, but the events of the past weeks had changed me. I was no longer the same person who had foolishly decided to investigate a cursed house. The fear had burrowed deep into my psyche, becoming a constant companion, a shadow that followed me everywhere I went. I could feel its presence in every dark corner, every quiet moment, as if the Watcher had left a piece of itself behind, embedded in my very soul. Sleep was elusive, And when it did come, it was plagued by nightmares so vivid, so horrifying, that I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. In these dreams, the Watcher would return, its shadowy form towering over me, its red eyes burning with a malevolent hunger. It would reach out for me, its fingers cold as death, and I would be powerless to resist, trapped in a cycle of fear and despair that had no end. Each time, I would wake up just before it could claim me, but the terror lingered, clinging to me like a second skin. But it wasn't just in my dreams that the Watcher haunted me. Strange occurrences continued to plague my life. Objects would move on their own, doors would slam shut without warning, and the whispers, those damned whispers, would follow me wherever I went, filling my mind with their dark, twisted words. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself that it was all in my head. But deep down, I knew that the Watcher was still with me, that it was waiting for the right moment to strike again. As the days turned into weeks, I began to notice that the curse was spreading. It wasn't just confined to the house anymore. It was reaching out, touching the lives of those around me. Friends and family who visited me would leave with a sense of unease, complaining of strange occurrences and eerie feelings that lingered long after they had gone. Some of them stopped visiting altogether, citing a vague sense of dread that they couldn't quite explain. The darkness that had infected my life was spreading like a disease, infecting everything it touched. The final straw came one night when I was driving home from work. The sun had long since set, and the road was dark and deserted, save for the occasional passing car. The trees on either side of the road loomed over me, their branches twisted into shapes that seemed almost human in the dim light. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was following me, just out of sight. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the Watcher looming behind me, but the road was empty, or so I thought. Suddenly, the car's radio crackled to life, filling the silence with a burst of static. I reached out to turn it off, but before I could, a voice emerged from the static, a low, guttural whisper that sent a chill down my spine. It was the same voice that had haunted me for weeks, the same voice that had filled my dreams with terror. It spoke only one word, but that was enough to send me into a panic. Soon, the lights on the dashboard flickered and the car's engine sputtered, as if something was draining the life from it. The temperature inside the car plummeted, and my breath fogged up the windshield. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white with fear, as I desperately tried to keep the car on the road. But the presence inside the car was overwhelming, suffocating, and I could feel it closing in on me, as if the Watcher taken the wheel. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the radio went silent, the temperature returned to normal, and the car's engine roared back to life. I gasped for air, my heart pounding in my chest, as I sped down the road, desperate to put as much distance between myself and whatever had just happened. But I knew deep down that I couldn't run from this. The Watcher was everywhere, and it would never let me go. When I finally made it home, I was shaken to my core. The reality of my situation was becoming painfully clear. There was no escape. The curse that had taken hold of my life was unrelenting, and the Watcher would continue to torment me until it had claimed my soul. And it was no longer a question of if, but when, and as much as I tried to resist, I knew that my strength was waning, that the darkness was winning. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized that there was only one way out. The curse had to be broken, and I was the only one who could do it. But breaking the curse meant confronting the Watcher once and for all, facing the full force of its malevolence. I didn't know if I had the strength to do it, but I had no choice. If I didn't, the curse would continue to spread, consuming everyone and everything I cared about. I spent the next few days preparing, gathering information, and arming myself with whatever I could find. Protective symbols, rituals, anything that might give me an edge in the final battle. The fear was constant, gnawing at me, but I pushed it down, channeling it into determination. I would face the Watcher, and I would end this, one way or another. The night of the confrontation, I returned to the house, the place where it had all begun. The air was thick with malevolence, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, slithering across the walls like living things. I could feel the Watcher, waiting for me, its presence more powerful than ever. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come, and stepped inside. The house was silent save for the sound of my own breathing, but I could feel the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. I walked through the rooms, the weight of Watcher's gaze heavy on my shoulders, until I reached the basement door. The final confrontation would take place where it had all started. I descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step, and entered the basement. The darkness was absolute, and I could feel the Watcher there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I began the ritual, speaking the words I had memorized, drawing the symbols that were supposed to protect me, but as I did, the shadows began to move, swirling together into the shape I had come to dread. Latin, Nitas. The Watcher emerged from the darkness, its red eyes burning with hatred, its form towering over me. The ritual had no effect. It was too strong, too ancient, and the protective symbols crumbled to dust under its gaze. The whispers filled the room, rising to a deafening crescendo, and I could feel the Watcher's power pressing down on me, suffocating me. But I didn't stop. I kept reciting the words, kept drawing the symbols, even as my vision blurred and my strength ebbed away. I had to keep going, had to fight, because if I didn't, the curse would never end. The Watcher's form began to waver, its grip on the physical world weakening, and I knew that I was close, so close to breaking the curse. With one final desperate surge of energy, I completed the ritual, shouting the last words with every ounce of strength I had left. The Watcher let out a sound that was not of this world, a scream of rage and pain that echoed through the house, shaking the very walls. Its form began to dissolve, the shadows unraveling as it was pulled back into the darkness from which it had come. And then it was over. The Watcher was gone, the curse broken. The house was silent once more, the air clear, the shadows still. I collapsed to the floor, drained but alive. I had done it. I had won. But as I lay there, exhausted, a new fear began to take hold. The Watcher was gone, but the darkness it had brought into my life was still there, a part of me now. I could feel it, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for the right moment to reassert itself. The curse was broken, but the scars it had left would never heal. I left the house that night, never to return, but the fear, the darkness, stayed with me. The Watcher was gone, but it had left its mark on me, a reminder that the line between our world and the darkness beyond is thinner than we think. And sometimes, when you look into the shadows look back. Even now, years later, I can still feel its presence, a whisper at the edge of my consciousness. I am just out of sight. The curse may be broken, but the terror lives on, haunting me, a constant reminder that some things are better left alone.